Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. We have people in person in the Lincoln Auditorium of the state's capital and people like me watching the program online. I am Anne Marie Fulfer, president of the Idaho State Bar Board of Commissioners, as well as a member of Attorneys for Civic Education, also known as ACE. ACE is one of the sponsors of today's program. ACE was founded in 2013 by a group of Idaho attorneys who recognize the critical importance of civics education in Idaho schools. ACE members appreciate that the key to a healthy, functioning democracy is a citizenry that is educated and knowledgeable about the United States Constitution and the importance of the rule of law to the continued health of our democracy. Today is Constitution Day, a day that recognizes the signing of the U.S. Constitution in 1787. In 2005, Congress passed a law that required every educational institution receiving federal funds to hold a program for students on Constitution Day. This year, Boise State University, the University of Idaho, and the College of Idaho have partnered with Attorneys for Civic Education and the Idaho Law Foundation to present the program, Democracy in the Age of Social Media, Civic Discourse, Ethics, and the First Amendment. Our program is being live streamed across the state with the assistance of Idaho Public Television. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's presentation, Deb Gresham. Deb is a partner with the Boise law firm of Givens Pursley. For more than 30 years, she has represented members of the media throughout Idaho and the region. Hello, Deb. The podium is yours.
Hello, Anne-Marie, and thank you so much. And welcome to all of you here today in person and to online. I love seeing so many students. I see that Boise High is represented here today, so go Braves. And welcome. I am asked to remind all of you here today in person to silence your phones since we have so many people here today for the program if you haven't done so already. Like Anne-Marie said, I am Deb Gresham. I am a partner in the law firm across the street called Givens Pursley, and for about a little over 30 years, I've represented the media here in Idaho and in the region and have dealt with the First Amendment. I'm really honored to be here today on Constitution Day to deal with this topic of democracy in the age of social media. Long ago, Thomas Jefferson noted that a democratic society depends upon an informed and educated citizenry. The idea is that the more that people know, the better equipped they are to make informed decisions about how government should work and how our democratic society should be structured. These values are enshrined in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, where both freedom of speech and freedom of the press are protected. So how important are these values? I submit to you that they're very important. And it's interesting to look at what Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Communist Party, the Russian Communist Party, said back in 1920. He said, "Why should freedom of speech and freedom of press be allowed? Why should a government which is doing what it believes to be right allow itself to be criticized? It would not allow opposition by lethal weapons. Ideas are much more fatal things than guns. Why should any man be allowed to buy a printing press and disseminate pernicious opinions calculated to embarrass the government?" Clearly, freedom of the press and freedom of speech are important for us, and important for us to all stay informed about things that matter and how we are governed. So, how do Americans stay informed on important matters? For many years, most people kept up to date on current events by reading their local newspaper or listening to the radio. Later, people turned to television and folks like Walter Cronkite, once dubbed the most trusted man in America, to get their news and information. But times have changed, and the sources of information that we all get our news from have changed. A recent Pew Research Center survey found that more than 8 in 10 U.S. adults, or 86%, say they get their news and information from a digital device, such as a smartphone, computer, or tablet, either often or sometimes. Specifically, where they get their information online differs by age, which with older Americans turning more often to news websites and apps, and younger Americans, ages 18 to 29, most often relying on social media for their news and information, a whopping 42% of them. So it's clear that we don't get our news and information from the same types of sources or even in the same way as we used to. And depending on your age, you're more likely to eschew traditional news sources altogether and instead look to social media for your news and information. So why should any of this matter? Well, because truthful and accurate information is not always synonymous with social media. In fact, a recent study by researchers at New York University found that from August 2020 to January 2021, misinformation got 6 times more clicks on Facebook than posts containing factual news. Winston Churchill once said that a lie gets halfway around the world before truth has a chance to get its pants on. And that was said before the internet and social media, where information and misinformation spread at an unprecedented pace. Instead of the idealized level playing field that the internet once represented, today's internet is dominated by algorithms that sort the data and information that we all see. And this is all done behind the scenes without you even knowing it. Thus, similar thinking people get their news that fits their view of the world, leading them to believe that such information must be true because they've read it over and over, and so have all of their friends. This new normal has impacted confidence in the news media, our constitutional institutions, and in our civic discourse norms. Only need to look at some of the recent events in history to see just how impactful and dangerous misinformation can be. Looking at the 2020 presidential elections and the many challenges that followed thereafter, of claims of voting systems deleting votes, in the fraudulent election, in the lawsuits that challenged those elections and the claims made in there. At least one federal judge recently characterized such allegations in those lawsuits as the stuff of which violent insurrections are made. We can also look at the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol and the rhetoric that fueled U.S. citizens to attack our Capitol and the police guarding it and the people inside. We have an example even closer to home in terms of the information and misinformation that has been spread regarding COVID and the use of vaccines in Idaho. As Governor Little noted in a recent article, reality is complicated when it comes to COVID and vaccines. Which brings us to this, and at least one cartoonist characterization of misinformation today. Riding alongside the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, next to war, famine, pestilence, and death, the 5th horseman is misinformation. Misinformation holding a smartphone. While social media may not have created all of this misinformation, it certainly helped spread word as quickly as possible to those groups that were most likely to believe it and act upon it. So today, on Constitution Day, a day that celebrates and marks the founder's signing of the Constitution, we're here to explore the idea, is social media a threat to democracy? Thankfully, you don't have to listen to me anymore. We have a distinguished panel of experts here today who will discuss how social media and misinformation are affecting our democracy and First Amendment jurisprudence. And we'll talk about how lawyers' rules of ethics may address some of those concerns. We'll also talk about ways that each of us can meaningfully combat misinformation through news literacy. I note that some of you may have questions as this presentation goes along. For those here in person, you're free to write them down and hand them to an organizer. And for those of you attending online, please feel free to submit those questions in the chat box. To the extent we have time, we will try and cover that, but I apologize at the beginning because I think we have a lot of ground to cover here with these 4 panelists and we may not be able to get to those. So briefly, let me introduce each of our 4 distinguished panelists, and I'm going to go in alphabetical order. First up, we have Dr. Seth Ashley. He's a professor in the Department of Communication at BSU, where he teaches journalism and media studies, news and media literacy, and media and democracy. He is also a faculty advisor to BSU's student newspaper, The Arbiter. He is the author of a book, News Literacy and Democracy, and his research on media literacy, media sociology, and communications policy has been published in a range of peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Ashley holds a PhD and an MA from the University of Missouri School of Journalism, as well as a BFA in production design from the University of Southern California School of Theater. Prior to completing his PhD, Dr. Ashley taught print and digital journalism at Stevens College in Columbia, Missouri. He's been at BSU since 2011, where his work centers on an examination of the role of media and democracy. Welcome, Dr. Ashley. Next, in alphabetical order, we have Professor Benji Cover, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Idaho College of Law, where he teaches election law, constitutional law, professional responsibility, and torts. Professor Cover studied engineering, mathematics, and economics at the University of Toronto, earned a master's in international development from the London School of Economics, and his JD from Yale Law School. After law school, Professor Cover worked on pretrial reform at the Public Defender's Office in New Orleans and as an Arthur Lindman Public Interest Fellow and Vital Projects Grants recipient. In 2013, he became a legislative director for the New Orleans City Council member LaToya Cantrell. And in 2014, Professor Cover joined the University of Idaho College of Law, where his research has focused on election law, electoral districting, also known as gerrymandering, and the First Amendment. Welcome, Professor Cover. Next up, we have Stelios Panagiottou, Dr. Stelios Panagiottou, and it takes practice to say that name. I'm hoping I'm getting close. He's an assistant professor in the political economy department at the College of Idaho, where he teaches cutting-edge political economy classes that have never been taught before, but capture the unique political economic moment through which we exist. Dr. Panagiottou studied sociology at the University of Tampa. He received his MA and PhD from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and thereafter began to situate his research at the intersection of capitalist economy and the democratic political system. He traveled to Greece during the peak of its financial crisis in 2015 to pursue an ethnographic study of the government's management regime and its deleterious effects on the Greek people. After publishing this work, he turned to his research focus to the United States and studying the ways in which corporations and humans practice politics, as well as the sources of corporate political power. Dr. Panagiottou is currently working on a research project that decenters the human from democracy and instead positions corporations at the center of American democratic processes. Welcome. And last but certainly not least, we have Betsy Russell. She's a distinguished journalist and Boise bureau chief and state government and politics reporter for the Idaho Press. Many of you might be familiar with her Eye on Boise blog that she's had since 2004, covering local and statewide issues, particularly at the Idaho legislature. Betsy is a longtime president of the Idaho Press Club, as well as president and founding board member of Idahoans for Open Government. She is a tireless advocate for the press in Idaho and a staunch believer in the First Amendment and open government. Betsy received her undergraduate degree from the University of California at Berkeley and a master's in journalism from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. As a longtime journalist, Betsy has firsthand experience in dealing with the rapid spread of information and misinformation through social media, and we'll share some of those experiences today. So welcome to our very distinguished panel. Thank you. So we're all here today to talk about democracy in the age of social media. So I really think it's important to start with some of the basics. And for that, Professor Cover, I'm going to turn to you first. As I mentioned, you teach at the University of Idaho College of Law, specialize in the First Amendment. Could you describe for our audience exactly what the First Amendment is and isn't? That is, what does the First Amendment apply to and what doesn't it?
Sure. Can you all hear me? Is that good? Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And I really appreciate the organizers, our fellow panelists, and all of you in the audience for being here today. So this is the text of the First Amendment. It's up on the screen. It's 45 words. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. A few things to note about the First Amendment. The first five words, Congress shall make no law, refers specifically to Congress, the legislative branch of the federal government. Over time, courts have understood the First Amendment to apply equally to all three branches of the federal government, courts, executive, and Congress. And also, after the passage of the 14th Amendment, through a process called incorporation, the First Amendment applies to state governments exactly the same way it applies to the federal government. But it only applies to governments. So I work at the University of Idaho College of Law. That's a public institution. Everything we do is governed by the First Amendment. A private law school is not governed by the First Amendment in the same way. The First Amendment doesn't apply. Imagine a private book publisher trying to decide whether or not to publish the new book of a controversial author. That decision is not governed by the First Amendment. And if the publisher decides not to publish that author's book, that author can't sue for a First Amendment violation. There's no governmental action. The First Amendment doesn't apply. Same thing if Facebook kicks somebody off of Facebook. Facebook is not a governmental organization. The First Amendment doesn't apply. There may be other issues, there may be other laws that apply, but the First Amendment applies only to governmental action. Now, in terms of the content of the First Amendment, it refers to 6 things. The first 2 have to do with religion, non-establishment of religion, free exercise of religion. And then the other 4 enumerated rights in the First Amendment are speech, press, assembly, and petition. The text does not explicitly refer to the right of association or of expressive association, but the courts have found over and over again that implicit in these First Amendment rights is a right of expressive association that has both positive and negative dimensions to it. Positive means you get to choose who you want to associate with. And negative means you get to choose who you do not want to associate with. And so that publisher, if they decide that they do not want to be associated with that controversial author and they choose not to publish that book, not only is that not a First Amendment violation because there's no governmental action, it's actually activity, negative expressive association activity by the publisher that itself is protected by the First Amendment. Now, there are free speech values that extend beyond the First Amendment. And so even when private actors are making decisions, the First Amendment might not be in play, but free speech values might be in play. And so it makes sense to say to that publisher, you got to be careful about what you're doing. If you're not going to publish the books of anyone who's controversial, that might mean that there's less discourse going on in this country. Maybe you should publish the book of somebody that's controversial. That is a free speech argument, but it's not a First Amendment argument because the First Amendment doesn't apply to the private publisher. But free speech values apply to all of us. Now, the final thing that I want to say is that is about the legal regulation of social media companies like Facebook. So Facebook is private. The First Amendment does not govern Facebook. There's been a lot of talk about what's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That act provides as follows. No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. Here's what this means. Imagine that I build a billboard and I write something on it. I am the speaker and the billboard is just my platform, right? And if you have a problem with what I say, and sometimes there can be legal liability for things that you say, not all, the First Amendment is not absolute. And so there is some speech that can be sanctioned, like child pornography, certain types of obscenity, certain types of true threats, certain types of false claims. If I put something on that billboard that you think is a lie that diminishes your reputation, you want to sue me for defamation, you can sue me, you can't sue the billboard. I'm the one who's talking, right? The question with Facebook is if a Facebook user posts something on Facebook, how should we understand Facebook? Is Facebook speaking or is Facebook like a passive billboard? that is just the platform for the speech of the user. What this statute does is it says treat Facebook like a billboard, not like a speaker. And so if you think that something, defamatory has been said about you on Facebook, you can sue the person who posted it, but you can't sue Facebook. Now, some people think that's a good idea. Some people think that's a bad idea. But note that Facebook is criticized for two different things and their intention. Some people say Facebook censors too many people on Facebook. And then other people say Facebook has too much protection under this law. But note that if we got rid of this law, and some people think we should, and Facebook had more potential legal exposure, it would probably engage in more censorship of what people say on Facebook because it would be more worried about being sued itself. So that's a little primer on what's going on with the First Amendment and social media.
Thanks, Professor Cover. One thing I wanted to follow up with you on is you're talking about Section 230. What are kind of the more traditional methods of imposing liability for misinformation on the media, and how has the Supreme Court looked at that traditionally, and is there any movement on that?
Yes. So for a very long time, for hundreds of years, at common law, you can file lawsuits against people for defamation. And defamation is saying something false about your character. So we have several hundred years of defamation law in the United States. In the 1960s, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a series of very important cases that said that the First Amendment imposes some limits on defamation liability. And so there's a famous case called New York Times versus Sullivan, which established something called the actual malice standard. And here's the idea of what's going on in New York Times versus Sullivan. Sometimes reporters try as hard as they can to get things right, but they're also trying to get information to people as quickly as they can. What happens if a reporter makes a mistake and publishes something that is false and that is defamatory, but they reasonably thought it was true at the time? They were relying on a source that provided false information to them. There was an honest mistake. The U.S. Supreme Court was worried that if any time the media made a mistake, they could be sued for a ton of money for defamation liability. It would have a huge chilling effect on the media. And that would be inconsistent with First Amendment values of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And so what the U.S. Supreme Court did is it said that the First Amendment requires that you can only win a lawsuit against for defamation if you can show that they knew it was false, or if they meet a heightened standard called actual malice, which means there are red flags that this is probably false and you should check it out more, but you don't look into it and you disregard that risk. You need to have that heightened mental state in order to win a lawsuit against somebody when they're writing about an elected official, a public official, or a public figure. Now, there was a very interesting decision from Justice Neil Gorsuch a few months ago. The U.S. Supreme Court decided not to hear an issue. They denied cert. And Justice Gorsuch wrote an opinion dissenting from the denial of cert, saying, I think we should hear this case and I think we should revisit that whole framework because I think there's too much misinformation going on. I think that media companies are not acting responsibly. And I think that we should make it easier to sue people for defamation and revisit the entire actual malice framework established in the 1960s in New York Times versus Sullivan. So the actual malice framework is here today, but there's a chance that the U.S. Supreme Court may revisit it in the future.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Panayotou. You study democracies. Can you talk a little bit about democracy and really what is it, and is the U.S. really a democracy? And then maybe address the First Amendment and how it all fits into this.
Yeah, thank you. I think we need to think about the difference between a democracy and a republic because there's a lot of confusion here, and there's a basic tension between democratic and republican forms of governance that are often overlooked or ignored, people often think they can be used interchangeably, and they cannot be. The difference pertains to conflicting stances on the political role of the citizenry and how a democracy is going to value equality over liberty, while a republic values liberty over equality. So let's kind of get into this a little bit. We all know democracy means rule of the demos, or the people, and we could further push this to the idea it's the rule of all people. This is a maximalist version of democracy, such that it's never been realized in any society that calls itself democratic, even ancient Athens, its origin. So, but how do people rule? Especially if we have differences within the citizenry, which we can expect in any modern society with, like the United States. We usually see this through the lens of majority rule, since it's improbable to think that all citizens would arrive at a unanimous consensus on a decision. But there's a flaw here. By sleight of hand, the majority de facto rules in the name of all. And it can actually get worse. The precondition for any legitimate democratic decision must be equality. Right? If inequality is rampant, there cannot even be a pretense that the decision is legitimate, because maybe it's made by someone with more power in the name of all. Yet we know that we have political, economic, and social inequality. Equality is a desire, it's an aspiration. And with all of these inequalities, they distort the political results and permit certain groups to have far more power than others, and even more might be a minority. Corporations and wealthy elites fall into this minority category who use democracy to its advantage. Now, a republic is different, but equally as problematic. It seeks to limit what the majority can do because it does recognize that the majority is not the whole political community. Even more, that people should not govern, frankly, because they're not smart enough. That representatives should do what the masses would do if they were enlightened. And they do so by creating restrictions on who can participate and govern, as the early American Republican context makes clear in its exclusion of slaves, Native Americans, women, and even men without property in many cases. Republics lean towards aristocracy, limited suffrage, concern for property rights, and a suspicion of the majority. The republic still legitimates itself based on representing the people, right? The Constitution says, "we the people," but the people are not the majority. So both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution make no mention of the word democracy. But the Constitution does use the term republic. And the founders explicitly rejected the principle of democracy because it lacked social or institutional forces to check the will of the majority. And in an ironic twist, they sought to protect minority interests, but not the minorities we tend to think of today, the minority of property holders, from the majority of property lists, which they feared would use the political system to redistribute land or, say, repudiate the debts. So a republic does not seek nor need equality. In fact, it shuns it, and it has since the beginning of the United States. And I think we should note the fundamental flaw of republicanism in that it legitimates itself based on a notion of the people and the common good, but it's the representatives who decide what that is. And this conception of the common good has seen the liberty of the citizens and a limited state, along with an unleashed capitalist economy through laws that sanctify individual property rights. So I think the United States is a very weird polity. We call ourselves democratic in everyday speech, yet the founders embraced Republican principles with a capitalist economy. And we live in an invisible battle between these logics. And in a way, the two parties represent each of these logics. And this is a real problem because in some ways they represent these contradictory, incompatible political agendas. But more to the point of today's talk, we could ask, is the First Amendment democratic? I'm not going to definitively come down one way or the other. I'm going to raise some tensions, though, that are expressed through the First Amendment. One response would be to suggest that it's necessary for democracy, right? The most obvious way to interpret the First Amendment is to see it as a shield against state repression, protecting individual acts of expression from censorship. And historically, this has been true. It's been important for protecting vulnerable groups and citizens because it protects individual rights. The liberty to have free thoughts and express them, the liberty of the people to assemble, to petition government, religion, free press, right? All of this is based on this notion of participatory liberty. We need to make sure people can be informed, talk, and ultimately influence government. But there's a different response we could point to here that neither the Bill of Rights nor the First Amendment is in fact democratic. This should not surprise us because the founders feared a democracy and the Bill of Rights was in no way designed to augment democracy per se. They feared this limitless will of the majority, which I think we see this hostility today in what we call cancel culture, right? Cancel culture resembles this democratic logic where a majority attempts to steamroll over the individual and cancel them. and really whether it comes from the left or right, there's a similar thrust here. A majority can cancel. That can be democratic. You can make that argument. But the First Amendment suppressed equality in some ways, and I want to talk about that, how it's been used to fortify a minority interest against equal protections that were in place to protect the majority, and how liberty and freedom can be a real danger to democracy. So we see this, I'll talk about corporations later, but I think we can talk about how the First Amendment has been used to basically support a white male Christian hegemony. As political theorist Wendy Brown has written, every kind of equality legislation has been challenged by a discourse based in the First Amendment for free speech and free exercise. In Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission, the cake shop owner argued that making a wedding cake for a same-sex marriage violated his First Amendment right to free speech. Now, what's so interesting about this claim, it was not made on behalf of religious liberty, which the First Amendment also protects, but would not have been upheld. Instead, the owner claimed that making this wedding cake would violate his right to free speech by compelling him in an act of artistry to express a message he disagreed with. And in couching the case this way and instrumentalizing the First Amendment for free speech in a wedding cake, the owner was able to make his private religious beliefs a public matter and circumvent public accommodation laws. Now, there's other cases like this, but all of this is to say that the First Amendment can be used as a weapon to protect liberty, to undermine equality, and advance a specific traditional morality in the public sphere. I think that this also, kind of to get to the point of this, we have to recognize the role of the Supreme Court. I would argue that a truly democratic society does not even need a constitution, let alone a Bill of Rights or First Amendment. The very idea that we today are beholden to standards enacted 200 years ago by white guys who are long since dead is deeply anti-democratic, because it really turns authority to 9 Supreme Court justices who interpret and rule based on what they think the intention of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is. And this is very much Republican. If you believe in a democracy, maybe we should question whether a written Bill of Rights in charge by 9 justices in a 5-4 decision where 1 justice can be the decisive factor is not very democratic. So I think we can start to see how this is a lot more complicated than we usually think.
Thank you. Everything's more complicated than we usually think. That's my perspective on all of this. I'd like to turn to Betsy now. Betsy, you're a longtime journalist and you're a member of the Fourth Estate and a true believer in the First Amendment, however complicated it is. Can you talk about why it's so important to have a free and fair press in today's world and for democracy? And touch on who's a journalist. You know, what people traditionally think about journalists may be different today than it was 50 years ago when some of these Supreme Court decisions were coming out, and kind of give us a sense of some of the trends that you've seen in your career.
Sure. So I'm a journalist. I know that. Who's a journalist? Here's a definition that was offered by the University of Missouri School of Journalism. Quote, someone employed to regularly engage in gathering, processing, and disseminating news and information to serve the public interest. That's not a bad definition. As a journalist, I do believe that the free and independent press is more important today than it ever has been, and it has always been important to the very functioning of our form of government. We have seen forces attacking our government institutions in ways that have been amplified through social media in recent years. And those same forces have tried for a number of years now to undercut legitimate news reporting with unfounded charges of, quote, fake news and social media-based disinformation and propaganda campaigns. While that appeals to each of those groups' supporters and true believers, overall, I believe it has not worked. Although the then President of the United States attacked our nation's legitimate news media constantly from 2016 to 2020, subscriptions to the New York Times and Washington Post tripled over that time period. Some people called that the Trump bump. Americans still want journalists to seek the truth and report it. The news business has changed quite a bit since I entered it as a young reporter. And the biggest change has been the arrival of the internet and the resulting collapse of the business model that always supported newspapers, which was based on community support through local advertising. The internet also brought a splintering of what we used to consider mass media. the news sources that pretty much everyone in our community and nation shared and had in common. Now, for some of you who are older, you may remember that that actually began before the internet with cable news, when people could start searching out news sources with which they agreed instead of all of us sharing them, making them mass media. So today with the internet, it's easy to seek out a narrow niche source for something that's like news, but really just reinforces one's biases. Nevertheless, journalism, what I do, is still with us. And in the United States of America, it absolutely has to be. Our form of government rests on free people freely participating in their government, informed by a free press that's free from the influence of that government. And I just said free a whole bunch of times, but for good reason. If we were to lose that, we would lose democracy itself. Whether you believe we are a republic or a democratic republic or a Republican democracy or some blend of those, people who do not know what their government is doing cannot self-govern. And what's unique about this country and our form of government is that it's based on governing ourselves. That's where freedom comes from. People who are uninformed can't choose the path they want their government to follow because the government's actual actions are hidden from their eyes. This is why I became a journalist, and it's an essential role for our free press. If we cannot have a functioning free society if government censors and controls the press. We know that. As Justice Louis Brandeis wrote in 1927, in this nation, when faced with, quote, falsehood and fallacies, as he wrote, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence.
Thanks, Betsy. I think we have lots of speech going on these days. It's just, what do you think of it? We got it from all kinds of sources, but thanks, Betsy. Dr. Ashley, I want to turn to you next. You specialize in looking at the role of media in democracy. In your book, News Literacy and Democracy, you say that we are, quote, living in an age of misinformation, but it began at least 500 years ago. So this isn't new. Social media isn't entirely to blame, or is it? Can you address that?
I can take this off, right? I'm vaccinated, don't worry. This is like a master class in contemporary life. I don't even want to talk. I just want to listen to them. This has been great. I'm trying to figure out what I can add to this. And I think my contribution is around, my study of the media system and its role in democracy, like Deb said. My big question that has guided all of my work is, why is the media system the way it is? And then is it designed to support the kinds of things that we need for democracy that you've heard about now? So, and I was thinking about talking about the kind of philosophical origins of the First Amendment might be helpful too. Thinking back to all the way back to John Locke and Voltaire and this idea of the marketplace of ideas and the idea that who put a truth and falsehood out there, and whoever heard of the falsehood winning out. I'm paraphrasing John Milton, not John Locke. Sorry. It's interesting too because he went on later to write a pamphlet about how people should be able to get divorced because there was no divorce back then, and the licensing boards they censored what he had to say. They said, no, we're not. This is not cool. You can't talk about this. And so that's when he wrote, well, we need to put it all out there. Let's get all this speech out there, and that's the answer. And so, but then later on, he went on to join the licensing board. So we're all full of contradictions around all of this stuff, which is interesting. And it's Voltaire paraphrased by a biographer who said, I might hate what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. So these ideals, I think, have been with us for a long time. They come from a good place. And this idea of, the answer to bad speech is always more speech. I think that comes from a really good place. But then I think to really address that, we have to ask hard questions about, do we have a system in place to support those goals? And I think that's where we sometimes fall short. So, and that's been true in, for a long time with the traditional news media. I think, if it was great if you were watching TV in the 1960s and everybody turned on the TV at 6 p.m. and everyone was watching the news, and we had a really nice shared base of facts, and we could start from there. But certain groups were left out of that discussion, and if you didn't see yourself represented in that kind of representation of the world, you might not want to even participate, or you might have really negative feelings about what's going on around you. So, obviously the internet and all the tech that we have today has opened up this discourse to everybody, and everybody who has access, which is still not quite everybody, but a lot more people than before can participate, which is great. But then we still have constraints on what can get out there, and influences on who gets to say what. So, and even in today's mainstream sort of legacy news outlets, there's still this gatekeeping process, right? There's still reporters and editors at kind of this individual level that decide what's going to become news, and that has pros and cons. We've got these people out there very carefully, diligently working, like Betsy, to go out and sit through these super boring meetings that nobody else wants to go to, and then tell us if anything important happened, right? And so that's really obviously important, but then you've got other kinds of reporters who are, have deadlines to meet, and, they have routines to follow, and they're under other kinds of pressures, and they have to make sure that their stories are going to get read, and they have to make sure that they're going to get, clicks and shares and all that kind of stuff these days. So there are all kinds of pressures, especially if you're at a commercial outlet, to, make sure that all of that's happening. So, and then at the higher levels, we have institutions outside just the traditional kind of legacy press that have a lot of influence on what we see and don't see, and certainly that includes social media, and that's what we're here to talk about. So I'll focus on that. And you've already heard some of this, and we often, I think, a lot of us who talk about this stuff, we say Facebook because that's the biggest, and like 2 billion daily users is, it's hard not to talk about Facebook, even though all you young folks, I know you're not on Facebook anymore, right? But you can think of Facebook as a proxy for all social media, right? It's the same principles apply, the same kind of like normative like ideas that we want from our public discourse, and also the legal issues that keep coming up. So whether you're talking Snapchat or TikTok or whatever, the same ideas apply. I don't even know if there's probably like 5 new ones that I still haven't heard about. So I try to keep up with my students. But so figuring out like what free really means in this context, like what are we free from exactly, and being free from government interference is certainly like that's sort of like the bare minimum I think that we want, right? But then I think it's important, and I'm glad that that Professor Cover started with, the first thing he told you was all the places where the First Amendment does not apply. So when you post on Twitter and Twitter removes that, no First Amendment issue there, right? That's private business doing what they want, and so they can do that. So I think that's like a fundamental thing that we misunderstand often about the First Amendment, and this sort of, like you mentioned, these sort of general like lowercase free speech ideas, these values that we have versus what the law actually allows and requires. So, and this really comes to a head when we figure out how to start dealing with misinformation in the current environment. So, like Deb said, yeah, I've written about this, how this is nothing new. At least since the birth of the printing press 500 years ago, people have been publishing falsehoods, right? That's not a new thing, and that has as much to do with who we are as humans and how our human brains work as it does with any kind of technology. So social media and the internet, it's just a new tool. It's just a technology that we can use to do good or bad, basically. So what kind of system are we creating around these tools, and are we putting structures in place in society that will help us have the best kind of discourse and dialogue that we can. So yes, getting more speech out there is great, but not all speech is equal, right? And the law recognizes that, and I think we as individuals recognize that too. But that's where news and media literacy comes in, and it really does put it on us as the individual to recognize all of this and try to figure out how to sort through it. So I think that's why understanding these basics, a lot of people think about news and media literacy as just like sorting truth from falsehood, right? And that's, again, a great place to start, but that's sort of the bare minimum, So figuring out, checking your source, and, knowing where your information is coming from, and is it verified in any way? Who actually did this reporting? All of that's really important. But then we also need to kind of understand how the institutions and systems that produce all this stuff operate. And so that's where, having an understanding of what Facebook and Twitter and others can do with you and to you is really important. And that's where we'd start talking about algorithms, which you probably all heard of by this point. But, figuring out how we just don't know exactly what these secret algorithms are doing. They're these proprietary black box formulas, hidden inside these private companies. And, occasionally they give us hints at how they're tweaking the algorithm. But we know through a lot of research how those tweaks can really affect us. They can make us more emotional. They can make us angrier. They can make us want to participate. They can make us want to drop out. We know there's a lot of important effects from all of this stuff. But what we don't know exactly is how it operates on the other side of the screen. So that's a big issue for all of us, trying to figure all of that out. I'll maybe pause there and we'll go from there.
I think, Dr. Panayotou, you have some comments on that.
Yeah, I kind of want to just go off of what then happens in the human brain when we're looking at information, misinformation, and facts. And in some ways, I think that if the problem was simply misinformation, we'd be in an actually pretty good place, because we just need to combat it with good information. But we realize pretty quickly that the information isn't simply the quality; it's how that information is processed. And so we can ask, who has a monopoly on truth anymore? Is there such a thing as objective truth? And this is, I don't think, just philosophic navel-gazing. I think this is real. We're being called that we're living in a post-truth society, and mistrust is rampant. It casts doubts on the findings of science. And I think what we need to confront is that we have a crisis of denialism. And denialism being a distinct socio-psychological phenomenon, and even more, it's bodily, it's emotional. It manifests as either denying something evidence says is true, or affirming something that evidence says is false. So if we think about the 2020 election, people saying that Trump didn't lose, right? This is denialism. This is why our society cannot mount an effective challenge to climate change. So many people are in denial about it, but even more people who believe in it but are in denial that we're not doing enough to actually stop it. Denialism is why the United States is having such a hard time managing the coronavirus. Anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers are in denial about the scientific evidence pointing to the efficacy of masks and vaccines. And so when you start to unpack denialism, you see how difficult this is to surmount. On the one hand, this is a cognitive problem. It deals with motivated cognition and motivated reasoning. This is an unconscious tendency to process information in a manner that suits one's goals. And the goal isn't to form accurate beliefs. It's to protect one's own view of the world. And the only information that is accepted is that which confirms their existing beliefs. But the other component is actually stronger and connected. It's emotional. There's a powerful emotional drive to reject and dismiss evidence. People don't want to feel stupid. They don't want to feel like they lost control. They don't want to think that their entire identity they invested in is wrong. And here we encounter the most important concept. It's ideology. We build up worldviews in our heads of what we think is real, how we think the world works, and what we want the world to be like. It doesn't matter if it's true or false to reality. That's not the point. The point is that we're attached to our ideologies because they give us security, certainty, and power. And this is all unconscious, which means we're totally not in control of how we process information and what ideologies we subscribe to. We just do it, we live it every day without cognitive reflection. We all have ideologies. The major problem is when they become steel-hard casings that are immune to challenge, and that people can cling to their ideologies and refuse to subject them to critical evaluation and admit to change them. At the heart of this matter, this is a real threat to democratic society if ideology functions like this, because we need people for a democracy to override their beliefs when confronted with facts and evidence, to submit themselves to the force of the better argument, to compromise with each other, to see each other as humans, not as enemies. And ideology reduces the world to black and white. It can turn people who disagree into enemies. This is really difficult in a diverse society like the United States. And a lot of these political questions are not just conflicts over values, but also facts. Should we have less or more gun control, place more restrictions on voting or not, raise the minimum wage, tax the rich, bail out the banks, bomb suspected terrorists? What's the correct answer to any of this? Well, probably depends on your ideology, which makes it even harder to come to agreement because we live in this ideological polarization where one side's facts are another side's falsities. And when we confront this, that facts in general are conflicted and not accepted, then we can't get people to buy into what maybe the other side is saying. And, I think we have to confront the unpleasant fact that a lot of people don't care about facts. They care about facts only insofar as it legitimates what they already believe and reject other evidence to the contrary. So I think we have a major problem in our hands to which misinformation is only the surface. Misinformation is a symptom, but this disease, I think, is actually much deeper than that.
Thank you. If only we were talking about, really hard, things that matter. We have some big concepts out here, don't we? Thanks for the panel for just bringing this up. I would like to turn our attention from these big picture concepts to some real life examples of how misinformation and social media have come into play in our recent history. And I will start with the November 2020 elections. And for that, I'll turn to Professor Cover, who, again, specializes in election law. And I know that you've studied the November 2020 elections pretty extensively. And truly, we could talk about that for hours. And that's a fascinating area. But I'll turn it to you to talk to our audience today about how American institutions fared through the November 2020 elections.
Thank you. So I invite you all to think of the 2020 presidential elections as a stress test for America, as a stress test for all sorts of different American institutions, including the courts, including media, including the legal profession. So how did we do? And I'm a professor, I'm used to grading things. So this is my grading of different institutions for how we did in the 2020 election. Voters, I think voters did great. It's really hard to run an election in the middle of a global pandemic. We had record turnout. And I think that the American voters should be applauded. I also think election administrators did very well under very difficult circumstances. And one of the things that's really sad and scary about the moment that we're in right now is that there are a lot of election administrators, and election administrators are not in it for the money or the fame or because it's the sexiest, highest powered thing to do. They're in it because it's a civic duty, and a lot of people who do election administration stuff, they're doing it on a volunteer basis. And they really believe in what they're doing. They're trying the hardest they can to do it right. And we have an epidemic right now of election administrators being harassed, being stalked, getting death threats. Last week, there was an organization that was created that's specifically a legal defense fund for election administrators to try to provide assistance to them with all of this horrible stuff that they're dealing with right now. I think election administrators did a very good job in the 2020 election under very difficult circumstances. How did the legal system do? I think the legal system did pretty well, both state and federal courts. There were dozens of lawsuits filed between, election day in November and when the results were certified in January. And courts operated very expeditiously. They did really rigorous testing of factual claims in a short period of time. And I think that, if you look at the published opinions from state and federal courts dealing with all of the claims that came in that few-month period, really thoughtful and apolitical legal analysis, including from recently appointed, federal appellate judges that were appointed by President Trump, ruling unanimously and rejecting claims that would have favored President Trump. Things that I think should inspire confidence in the independence of the federal judiciary. I also think it's important to note a lot of these lawsuits, very few of them actually alleged fraud of any kind. A lot of them alleged technical issues, like state statutory requirements said that poll observers should be 15 feet away, and they were 20 feet away under COVID, and they need to allow them to move closer. There were claims like that. There were claims that state election officials were not properly interpreting state election rules about absentee ballots or how to cure a defective ballot. There were claims about absentee ballots being handled differently in one county than another, and that being an equal protection problem. There was very, very little. There was a ton of claims made on social media about fraud, but very few lawyers actually made those claims in court. And it's interesting because Rudy Giuliani made a lot of allegations of fraud outside of courtrooms. He actually argued in federal court in one of the cases on one day. And there's a back and forth. It would be interesting for you to look at the transcript that he had with the court, because the judge specifically asked him, is there an allegation of fraud in the suit? And Giuliani eventually says, no, we're not making any allegation of fraud in this case. But I think the courts did a really good job handling all of these lawsuits. I think social media did pretty badly. Just massive disinformation, right? Just nonstop fire hose of disinformation. And there are millions of Americans who believe wild claims without evidence that undermines their faith in American democracy, and I think that played a significant role in the attack on January 6th. I did a radio program like shortly after the election, and it was a call-in program. I'm thinking about this when you're talking about denialism. I'm hopeful that there might be some people who are in a hardcore state of denial. No matter how much you expose them to factual information, they'll just dig in deeper. I'm hopeful that there's a group of people out there that if you can expose them to accurate information, you can actually change their minds. There was an older gentleman who called into the radio program, and it's stuff that he saw on Facebook about how in Pennsylvania there were more absentee ballots cast than were sent out. And I know the right answer to that. They're just using the wrong numbers, and they're using numbers from one year instead of from another year. I have a whole file of how to debunk, various claims. It's a little bit of whack-a-mole, but I've gotten pretty good at it. This guy, I don't think had a political agenda. I don't think I just think what he's exposed to from family and friends and what he's seeing on Facebook is really troubling to him. And he doesn't have the time to go through and try to debunk everything that's coming his way. And I think he sincerely was troubled and trying to understand better what happened with that. And I'm hopeful that I was able to provide a response to him that provided some assurance to him. But I think social media is not doing a very good job. I think the courts are doing a much better job than social media at separating fact from misinformation. The Electoral College held but proved vulnerable because some state actors sought to override the popular votes of their states. And some members of Congress advanced troubling views about what is the proper role of Congress in the counting process. I think that the relevant text of the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act does not provide enough guidance about how that's supposed to work. It underspecifies what's supposed to happen. It relies a lot on norms, and I think we have problems with those norms eroding, and I think that that's an issue for what is going to happen, what are state actors and members of Congress going to do in 2024, 28, and beyond. How did lawyers do specifically? I think the vast majority of lawyers did a really good job complying with all ethical requirements and trying really rigorously to make sure that they were presenting non-frivolous legal and factual claims in courts. But there, I think, are a few lawyers who did not meet those requirements. And we have state bar actions going on right now that I could talk about in more detail about some lawyers. And then, I think there's two other questions, which is, how did we do in terms of the professional regulation of lawyers and legal ethics? And I think we're doing pretty well. And I think that state bars have been pretty active in looking at what lawyers, whether lawyers complied with ethical rules. And I think courts are looking at whether lawyers complied with ethical rules. I also think there's a question about how defamation law is, whether that's working to constrain false claims about the 2020 election. Some of you may have heard that Dominion Voting Systems has filed a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit against Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell. I will say one thing about Sidney Powell specifically. So she's a lawyer, right? And some of you might have seen her on TV making very strong factual claims about massive fraud in the election. She filed a response to the defamation action by Dominion. And in her response, she says that she cannot be held responsible for defamation because no reasonable person would think that she was actually making statements of fact. And I can show you her response. And I think that is a slap in the face to people like that elderly gentleman who called on that radio program and might have seen her on TV and was really troubled by what she was saying. She is in court right now saying, if you thought I was making factual claims, you're an idiot. And I think that that's really troubling. But So overall,
Can I add, that's not the only person who's used that defense either, right? I mean, I'm thinking like Alex Jones after Sandy Hook, like he said, oh, it was psychosis. I didn't really mean it. I mean, making up these excuses after the fact has become the way out of making these really outlandish claims. And then, and you're absolutely right. That it just confuses people intentionally. That's kind of the point, right?
And clearly that is the opposite of journalism. Journalism is seek the truth and report it. It's not find lies and try to convince people of them. That's why what Alex Jones does is not journalism.
I think you bring up, Professor Cover, I think you bring up a really important point. And that's the role of lawyers. And why is what lawyers say in a courtroom different than what lawyers say perhaps on social media or in other ways? Can you maybe just, and you touched on it a little bit about bar-related actions, but kind of the rule of ethics and how that applies?
yeah, so I mean, every state has its own ethics rules. They're mostly based off of the American Bar Association's model rules. Model Rule 3.1 says that it's a professional misconduct to make a frivolous claim in court, to file a claim that has no non-frivolous factual or legal basis. Rule 3.3 makes it professional misconduct to knowingly make factual, false statements of fact to a tribunal. And Rule 4.1 says something similar about making false claims to third parties. Rule 8.4 says it's professional misconduct to engage in fraud or deceit or other untruthful conduct. So the New York bar there's an interim suspension of Rudy Giuliani's bar license in New York. But if you look at the complaint, they go statement by statement, and they ruled that for those purposes, they would only find misconduct if they found that Rudy Giuliani knew the statements were false at the time that he made them. And they went statement by statement and explained why they came to the conclusion that he knew the statements were false at the time that he made them. So just one quick example, Rudy Giuliani has said 6 or 7 times that Joe Frazier died in 2012 and then voted in the 2020 election. That's not true. Journalists looked into this, and they found that 3 months after Joe Frazier's death, election officials removed him from the voter rolls, properly according to state processes. And that information was presented to Rudy Giuliani. And then he kept making the statements. And he actually made the statements 3 times after the complaint was filed with the New York bar, specifically accusing him of knowingly making this false statement. You can violate ethical rules and be sanctioned by the bar when it comes to the level of making knowing false statements before courts or in matters related to litigation.
We've been talking about the special rules that apply to lawyers and they're kind of ethical rules that apply to them, but I want to turn to Betsy and ask her about, do similar rules apply to journalists when they're making statements, and how does that work?
Well, the answer is yes, but the media is not monolithic, obviously. But you will find that every legitimate news organization has a code of ethics, and most of them are similar to the Society of Professional Journalists Code, which is arranged around 4 principles, one of which I've mentioned a couple times: seek the truth and report it. The second one is minimize harm. Third is act independently. And fourth is be accountable and transparent. And legitimate journalists take these ethical principles very, very seriously. And any violation destroys our reputation as a journalist. And our reputation is all we have. It's the only reason why people would believe what they read in the newspaper. And you do see accountability. It's not through the government. It's not through a bureaucratic structure that's nationwide. It's through individual news organizations enforcing their own codes of ethics. Reporters can get fired for doing things like signing a petition or participating in a march on a subject on which they report, because that shows that perhaps suggests they're not acting independently. They're expressing opinions as to what they want the outcome to be on the very matters that they're trying to present facts about. We did see an example of ethical concerns coming into play this year here in Idaho, when a local TV reporter followed and filmed a young woman who had accused a sitting state legislator of rape after the unnamed young woman had testified anonymously at a House Ethics Committee hearing from behind a screen. This reporter's action was a clear violation of the minimize harm portion of that code of ethics that I just referenced. It was also in direct contradiction to the rules for the hearing, which have been explained to all, including the press, by the chairman at the beginning. The reporter's Capital Correspondents Association credentials were revoked. That was a decision made by her fellow journalists. Her station fired her. This followed a year in which we had seen violent disruptions of legislative proceedings here in Idaho, including an unruly crowd breaking a glass door in the Capitol in its rush to fill up a gallery where seating had been restricted due to the coronavirus pandemic. I believe Deb mentioned that earlier. Both in our state and elsewhere in the nation, members of the news media often were put in danger when covering these events. Shortly after the January 6th riot, I participated in nationwide training for journalists on covering hostile situations and safety issues. And this was really kind of harrowing that we had to talk about these things. Things like, don't put your media badge around your neck. Attach it to your belt loop so that someone can't use it to try to strangle you. Don't dress in black. I know a reporter who at the time usually dressed in black. You'll be assumed to be a member of a certain group. Don't wear a ponytail. Someone can yank on it. And these are things reporters have to think about when going into crowds now, hostile crowds, to cover events. I drove through the anti-Biden protests at the president's visit this past week. And there were lots and lots of protesters out there who were very, very hostile and very, very angry. And on a variety of issues. There were apparently 3 or 4 different protests going on at once, all in the same place. And when I got up to the gates of NIFC, which I had to drive through because I was in the press pool, the people were completely blocking the road. So how was I going to drive through? Well, I kind of smiled and waved, and a nice young man with a big flag came over and asked people to move out of the way, and I drove on through. I was fine. I spoke with another reporter who came in for the same pool, who was in a truck with his station's ID on it. He didn't get the same reception. There were people pushing on his car. This is concerning. This is something that journalists face these days in covering a very strange situation in our country driven by intentional misinformation, what the professor called denialism, which I find a very scary concept. If we're going to seek the truth and report it, we need to rely on people to do cognitive reflection, as he mentioned, because we're providing information in the hope that people will consume it and make their own decisions, not that they'll deny it.
Thanks, Betsy. I hope especially the students here today understand what Betsy just said and what she explained her and her profession are going through to get information out. It's harder than ever. And before I move on, I just want to bring up one thing. I'm on the statewide Idaho Press Club board with Betsy, and in our last meeting, there was a serious discussion about the type of training that is needed for journalists throughout Idaho, and it's mental health training and the stresses that reporters every day are going through. And so I just wanted to address it. It's getting harder and harder for everybody, but to give a little grace to those people like Betsy who are trying to do the right thing and bring people information that they can then act upon. So hats off to Betsy and her colleagues. That's just my promo, but I wanted to make you all aware of that. I'm going to turn now.
Well,
go ahead.
Before you move on, I have had people ask me, how do you combat claims that say COVID isn't real? You know, that the very things we're reporting on are not real. And this goes back to the denialism question. And this is something that I have actually dealt with for years when covering the state legislature, for example, I might be covering a House floor debate and a member may be making an argument that is clearly factually incorrect. And this is challenging for me because I both write a live blog and I write stories for the newspaper. And I might quote something in my live blog saying, Representative so-and-so just said X. And it may not be until later that I'm able to go back and juxtapose the facts next to that so that my story has the full context. And if you read my blog beyond just that one post, you'll find out both what they said and how that stacks up against the facts. I did have one instance this last session where a representative during debate said something that was very easily contradicted by everything that was out there. We had, there was a debate going on about funding, allowing the state to accept federal funds for COVID testing in schools. And we had a representative oppose this concept because she said children can't carry the COVID-19 virus. Well, we clearly know that's not true, and we had numbers of thousands of children who had been infected with it in our state. And so I was able to, on the spot, put that into my blog post. But the way that I deal with people making clearly false claims is not for me to contradict them. It is something that I need to do in my reporting. So I need to avoid false equivalencies. In other words, there can be a tendency in journalism to say, well, you know, Joe said this and Jane said this, so there's the two sides of the story. But if someone is telling you that the sky is blue and someone else is telling you that it's orange and it's very clearly blue, we do have to make that clear in our reporting. So this goes back once again to seek the truth and report it. I've got to find those facts along with reporting the statements of our elected representatives and public officials and putting them into context. That's the job of a journalist.
Thanks, Betsy. I'm going to turn a little bit now to really the impact of social media. And some of you may have heard of these cases coming from the Supreme Court called Citizens United and Hobby Lobby. In those cases, the Supreme Court recognized that the spending of corporate funds on political messages is a form of political speech that's protected by the First Amendment. Dr. Panayotou, what effects do you see this having on the democratic process, and what can individuals do in the arena to ensure that their voices are heard? And more specifically, can you talk about how social media has entered the picture and with it the role of corporations in our politics today?
Yeah, thanks. So corporations are usually thought of as these market actors, but they're actually intimately connected to politics in the public sphere. There are state charters that grant them their legal rights that make corporations what they are. They're political in a number of ways, but I want to just point out one important one for today, which is corporations are treated as political actors who can influence the construction of public policies, regulations, and laws. This kind of goes back to the 14th Amendment, actually. They've been granted protection back in the 1880s. Originally, this was passed to protect free slaves during Reconstruction from discrimination, but they've been granted to corporations. So corporations are legally seen as persons. They're a protected class of persons, just like you or I. And this set the stage on a path of corporate personhood that has culminated in Citizens United, Speech Now, and some of these other rulings. And once again, we confront the First Amendment here. Since 1976, the Supreme Court case in Buckley versus Vallejo attached First Amendment protections of free speech to corporations, and money comes into the picture here. How? Right? Well, it takes money to express oneself. Of course, I could go outside on the street corner here and advocate for or against the election of a candidate. I could yell till I am hoarse. And at the end of the day, it took more effort than it was worth to reach a mass audience. Instead, I might print my political message on a sheet of paper and make 1,000 copies and plaster them all over the city. I might record my message and pay for it to be played on an ad on YouTube or Facebook. And the courts have found that physically speaking and paying money to broadcast one's speech are functionally the same thing. What this means is that campaign finance laws and rulings have made electoral influence fair in theory. Anyone can use their money to express themselves, but unfair in practice because the ability to use money is stratified, right? There's some people with a lot more money than others. And so this is the equivalent of turning democracy over into the free market and commodifying political power, which can be a major problem. So again, I think we need to understand this tension between liberty and equality. The liberty of the First Amendment here to petition government, which is applying to corporations, smothering the political equality needed for a democracy. We should recognize what the Bill of Rights does not do. It doesn't make any effort to create an equal citizenry. And it's not that we haven't created more equality, right? We've legally not allowed race or gender inequality in politics. But one inequality that we have never touched in politics is economic inequality. We allow that every day, and we actively legitimate it in the market where people with more money are able to translate that into political power. So what can we do? We can try to legislate money out of politics. There's tons of bills that attempt to tackle this, even though if there's not the political will. But we should understand that money in elections is not the primary problem, actually. We could legislate this out, but that's the tip of the iceberg. There's 12 times more money spent lobbying than in elections. And here again, this is the First Amendment. This is the right to petition government, to influence or lobby them. And this has been exploited in many ways by corporations more than citizens lately. The next issue I want to address is social media. These are corporate-controlled spaces, right? Social media may, in the early days, have started as an instrument of human connection, like MySpace, early Facebook, connecting people. But the logic of corporations is expansionary, and since then, they have taken over the function of traditional public spheres. So they're integral features, not only influencing, but actually establishing the space where people get information and talk to each other. So this is really important because these are virtual public spheres, and the quality of information and dialogue has deteriorated. And I would say that the threat cuts both ways. On the one hand, it depoliticizes the citizenry. I mean, you can spend all of your time on TikTok or Twitter or Facebook and never see a political message if you curate that out of your feed. On the other hand, social media can create hyper-partisanship and extreme polarization. And I think we need to understand Facebook and Twitter and these as they have one goal, and that is profit-making. And to do so, they are essentially harvesting your information. The Cambridge Analytica story is that which tries to quantify your personality. And in doing so, target you with ads, not only for consumption, right, but also to influence your political behavior. This was used in 2016 with Trump. This was used in Brexit. We don't know exactly how much this influenced people, but we do know that this is the beginning. There is a lot of money to be made in knowing who you are and targeting you in specific ways. So I think that, yeah, that's important to think about.
Given that's a lot of problems with social media, given all those problems, Betsy, does social media have a role as a source of legitimate news today?
Absolutely. I use social media every day in my job. I send a tweet every time I post a new item on my Eye on Boise blog. When President Biden was here on Monday, I live tweeted the whole visit. My newspaper uses platforms like Facebook and Instagram to steer readers to our journalistic work and to reach out and to engage readers and involve them in our coverage. But Facebook, unlike my newspaper, of course, doesn't have a code of ethics that's respected by its contributors, and I think we may hear more about that from other panelists. Personally, I have found it very gratifying that when someone sends out something false on social media, others very often respond immediately to correct it, and I think that's the best kind of crowdsourcing.
Thanks, Betsy. Dr. Ashley, we've talked all about the problems of misinformation and fake news. Is there any way out of this mess? You know, you've written about the importance of news literacy. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what it is and how it might help us combat the problems we're facing.
I would love to. I just thought, first of all, I want to add a postscript to the story Betsy told about that reporter who was fired. They now work for the Idaho Freedom Foundation. They got hired there to be, a reporter for that organization. So.
And to spend time attacking the credibility of other reporters.
Right. So I just wanted to point out, like, that kind of partisan interest group, they don't share the same values as journalists like Betsy, and they're not as interested in, upholding those. So I think that's important to note. I thought the way that I might frame this is to just talk about, I often get this question of, like, why is everything so messy? Why is it so hard to just get the truth? Like, why can't someone just tell me the truth, right? And so I have, like, about 4 responses to that. people say they just want the facts. Just give me the facts, right? So number one, no, you don't just want the facts, because if you were, you would all be reading Betsy's really careful, meticulous reporting, and most people do not. Most people instead are scrolling through, a social media feed, or they're watching, Netflix, right? So I think it's important to remember, the difference between the kind of commentary you see. I love watching The Daily Show. I think that's really entertaining, and it might help me think about some stuff, but that's not my only source of news. And so going to those original sources and making sure that that's a good, that we're getting it from the people that are actually doing the reporting, and not just on cable news where they throw up a couple of talking heads to scream at each other. Like that's really cheap, and it's really good for their profit margins, but they're not really advancing. They're not doing any kind of original reporting themselves, and they're not really helping us understand complex issues a lot of the time. So, number two, facts are disputed and complex. I think we just have to accept that that's just kind of the way it is. Like, things are going to be messy because there's a lot of complicated information that we have to understand. Number three is the idea that the media system is not set up to make it easy for us to get careful, legitimate information on a regular basis. And so that's where, I think there's a media reform agenda that pushes for more public media, more public broadcasting that would help make that kind of nonprofit, non-commercial information more readily available and accessible. And then to use the First Amendment, like Justice Hugo Black said back in 1945 when they were talking about the Associated Press's role in distributing information, and they basically got in trouble for violating the Antitrust Act. And so this is when the AP said, he said about the AP, you can't say that the First Amendment prevents us from stepping in and promoting free expression and using the law to help make sure that there is wide distribution and access to good quality information. So I think there's room for this idea going forward in terms of how we use First Amendment and government to help promote good quality information. And I know that's sticky and subjective, but I think we're going to have to deal with that question at some point. Otherwise, it's just going to get worse before it gets better. So thinking about our media system and how we might, build up those structures to support the kind of information that we want. We can also just look to basically every other Western developed country to see how they do it. They invest way more money per capita into their public media systems. They have these mixed hybrid systems. There's still commercial media, right? And there's not the system of government propaganda. I'm not talking about North Korea, but I'm talking about the way that they do it in Europe and Britain and other places where there's a much more mixed media environment, and they do things like in Britain where they have a 10-year charter for the BBC to help protect them from political meddling, basically. So that helps support some of our, I think that protects us from some of the fears people have about why would I want government more involved in my media, right? So I get that fear. We don't want propaganda coming from our public media. That's not the point. That's why independence is such an important value, and we need the structures in place to make that happen. Finally, and fourth, in terms of why is it so messy and what can we do about it? For all this news literacy stuff, I mean, this is all this what you can see on the screen. It's again, bare minimum, check your sources. Is it satire? Check your own, see where it's coming from. Check your biases is kind of the important part. Just slowing down. And, we make these gut decisions. We use these mental shortcuts, heuristics to try and, just very quickly feel out this, whether we believe something or not. That's great, but try to be mindful of what is it about that gut check that's making you, that's letting you make the judgment that you're making. Because so much of what we do is driven by our very primitive monkey brains that are all about fight or flight on the savannah and fleeing from that saber-toothed tiger. That's not, we're wired for that environment, not for a social media environment. So figuring out how to slow down and just make our reactions more deliberate and mindful to the stuff that we're seeing. And I think that's the number one thing people can do. Try to bring those, whatever analytical abilities you have to bear on the kind of stuff that you're seeing. More than anything, that's what seems to be the kind of personality factor. People that are better at that kind of critical analytical thinking are the ones that just do better in terms of determining what's true and false. So just try to do that for yourself is one thing you can do immediately when you leave here. The media reform agenda is that's for another day. But what can you do right now is think about about that stuff very carefully when you're consuming it. In terms of dealing with misinformation, sometimes just not repeating it is the best thing to do. Or if we do repeat it, we need to be super clear and simple in how we correct the record. So being very straightforward about how masks and vaccines work and how horse treatments are not great. And so. Why did I even say that? I shouldn't have even said it, but just being very clear and simple in our discussion of those things is really important. And I think when you're talking with family members, you can bring those kinds of guidelines to bear. There's a lot of kind of misinformation best practices out there. The last thing I'll say is that the reason I think news literacy and media literacy is so important is because it's tied to all these kind of pro-social outcomes that we want and that we kind of like assume we'll get if we teach people and educate people in a democratic society. But what we've seen so far is overwhelmingly people who do better on our measures of news and media literacy. They're also the ones they're more knowledgeable about political issues. They know more about current events. They're more engaged in the system. They have higher levels of political self-efficacy, meaning they think that their voice matters, that they can actually participate and engage in the world rather than feeling like they're left out of it because it's like they can't do anything about it. So all this stuff seems to go hand in hand, and we want to promote this kind of stuff as much as possible. And I think that all starts with education.
Thank you, Dr. Ashley. We are just about out of time, and as I suspected at the beginning, we will not be able to take questions, although I'm sure all of us have lots of them, and I've been seeing notes pop up on screen that there's lots of questions. So I apologized before, and I'm apologizing again. I do want to end on a positive note. This is not all doom and gloom. We've heard about what's happening right in our society, that courts are getting it right, that we have an independent judiciary that is considering these hefty arguments, and regardless of who appointed those judges, they're coming out on the side of following the rule of law, and we should all be very proud of that. Thank you to each of our panelists today. This has been a really interesting, and like I said, we could go on for a while. So thank you to each of you for being here today. Thank you to our sponsors, Attorneys for Civic Education and the Idaho Law Foundation. And thank you to all of you here in person and online. It's been great to have you all attend on this Constitution Day. And thank you for being involved, and feel free to volunteer or get involved with either the Attorneys for Civic Education or the Idaho Law Foundation. And with that, we're done. Thank you so much. We could talk forever.
Idaho in Session is brought to you by Union Pacific Foundation, Boise State University School of Public Service, Idaho State Broadcasters Association, Idaho Cable Broadband Association, Association of Idaho Cities, University of Idaho James A. and Louise McClure Center for Public Policy Research. Additional funding provided by the Friends of Idaho Public Television Endowment,